Not every story begins in a snowstorm. Not every truth comes wrapped in ribbon. Some arrive on porches in the deep south, where the air is thick with pine and politics, and the only sleigh bells you'll hear are wind chimes caught in a slow December breeze. That's where I found him. John Neely Kennedy, senator from Louisiana, son of Centerville, Mississippi. A man who sounds like a Mark Twain short story and debates like an Oxford debater raised on gospel and grit. Now, I don't usually stop by politicians' homes during Christmas week. They're a tricky bunch, busy telling stories of their own, some truer than others. But this one I'd been meaning to visit for a long time. It wasn't just the quotes, though I've heard them, believe me. The one about the FBI acting like it's run by a bunch of misfit toys, or the time he said politicians ought to be drug tested. At least then we'd know what they were thinking. No, it wasn't the sound bites that drew me in. It was the silence in between, the pauses, the way he'd glance off camera just for a second, like a man remembering something he used to believe in. You see, people think I only watch who's naughty and nice, but I pay closer attention to who's drifting and who's quietly hoping they're not. So, on a quiet night in early December, I left the roar of the pole, let the reindeer sleep in the pasture, and took a slow walk down to St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana. No flying entrance, no rooftop theatrics, just Santa on foot beneath Spanish moss and a sky full of questions. The porch light was on. The screen door creaked like it hadn't in years, and there he was, sitting in a rocking chair, bare feet in wool socks, holding a well-worn copy of the Federalist Papers and sipping something that smelled like a Christmas bourbon blend. He didn't jump, didn't blink, just looked up and said, "Well, I'll be. Took you long enough." We sat for a while in silence, that comfortable southern silence where words aren't rushed because the stories are still forming. Eventually I broke the quiet. "John," I said, "you've been on my mind." He smiled a crooked smile. "Lord help me," I chuckled. "Now don't worry. I'm not here to scold. I came for a talk. Not about votes, not about headlines, about something a bit older." He leaned back. "You talking about the soul, Santa?" I nodded. "You could say that. Let me tell you something about John Neely Kennedy. Most folks know him for his quips. He once called critical race theory the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and I've heard some pretty dumb things. He called inflation as welcome as a root canal in a hurricane. He delivers them with rhythm, with timing, like a southern comic who happened to pass the bar. But what people forget is that behind the accent is a man who's seen the insides of 3 continents. Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, graduated from Vanderbilt. UVA Law, clerked for Judge Duplantier. He studied the Greeks, the Constitution, and the mechanics of power. He knows what language can do. And that's exactly why I came. Because somewhere along the line, plain talk turned into theater. And the boy who once admired Bobby Kennedy now stood in rooms where jokes sometimes outweighed justice. "John," I said, "you've built a stage, and it's a mighty stage. But stages can turn into cages if the script ain't right." He didn't speak. I went on. "You know how to cut through noise. But in these days, when truth sounds like treason to some, cutting isn't always what people need. Sometimes they need someone to stitch." We got to talking about Louisiana, the flooding, the grit, the gumbo, the grace. About the voters who call him our guy and the critics who call him a showman. He told me about growing up in Zachary, Louisiana, learning that real Southern strength came not from being loud, but from being still long enough to hear someone else's pain. We spoke of his switch from Democrat to Republican. Not a betrayal, he said, but an evolution. The state changed, the tides changed, and he wanted to speak in a language his people understood. I respected that. What I questioned was how often the voice of the people gets buried beneath the applause line. So I opened my journal, my real one, the one I only bring out for visits like this. And I read to him a line I'd written the night before. "In a world where everyone's screaming, the bravest thing you can do is speak like you care, not like you're trying to win." He stared at the stars for a while, didn't blink, didn't sip. Then he said, "You know, Santa, sometimes I talk like a man who's trying to get the headline, but most days, I just miss talking like a man who used to teach Sunday school." I looked at him. That man's still there, John. But you've got to choose him again every day. In every hearing, in every joke, in every moment when you're deciding whether to throw a punch or lend a hand. We stayed quiet again. The air smelled of cypress and distant pine smoke. A car passed by, slow and humming. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and gave up. Before I stood to leave, I reached into my coat and handed him a small card. On it, a quote from his own speech in 2021, "It is not racist to say that crime is a problem. It is unwise, however, to pretend that it has no roots." I'd written underneath, "Now go deeper, John. Name the roots. Help pull them up, not for applause, but for the child waiting for a world that makes sense." He took the card, folded it slowly, put it in his inside pocket, didn't say much, but he didn't have to. As I walked down the steps, boots brushing against cracked concrete, he called out, "Santa, you reckon words can still fix things?" I stopped, turned back. "They can," I said, "but only when they're used by men brave enough to speak the truth, even when it's not funny." He nodded, and I disappeared into the stillness. Because that night, I didn't visit a senator. I visited a storyteller with the power to become something more. A bridge builder, a conscience in a coat, a man who could still change the temperature of a room by choosing honor over heat. And that, my friends, is the kind of man who deserves a Christmas visit. Not because he's perfect, but because he still listens. And deep down, see you're on the next Santa's adventure.